Namaste viewers, welcome to the Ex-Christian Show. In this video, I will introduce you to the concept of pious fraud. Yes, the word is pious fraud. Sounds funny, isn't it? But pious fraud is an integral part of Christianity right from the beginning of its history. In the words of William Edward Hartpole Lecky, the very famous Anglo-Irish historian, who said, Christianity floated into the Roman Empire on the wave of credulity that brought with it this long train of plagiarized superstitions and legends. Christianity has thrived on fear of mankind and fed on the faith of gullible believers. It has, since its invention, devised and practiced every trick in the book. The Church Fathers, who established the doctrinal foundations of Christianity, have provided us with ample proofs of confessions of fraud and forgery in the inventions of biblical stories, in the development of its doctrines, and its spread by guile. Even though there is a wealth of literature produced by critics of Christianity on how the early church forged historical documents and committed fraud in promoting those manipulated documents as history, in this video, we are not going to use those as sources. Instead, we will use the confessions of some of the most important defenders of Christianity to prove that exact point. But I have to note that of the great mass of literature that the defenders of Christianity have left for us, only a small sample can be given. For further reading, the links to the writings are provided in the description of the video below. The scholars of the 19th century came up with a term for this unethical practice. It's called pious fraud. This oxymoron is at the crux of the development and spread of the cult of Christianity. What exactly is pious fraud? In the Christian context, pious frauds are fraudulent practices that the church fathers, or simply the church, employed in order to elevate the tiny first century Jewish cult to the status of a religion that came to be called Christianity. Following this, the church committed limitless fraud to advance its agenda of controlling the masses and filling its coffers. To this end, the misguided, religiously zealous church fathers fabricated miracles and misled gullible people. All this, despite the verse in the Bible that says, "All liars shall have their part in the lake that burns with brimstone and fire." Now, thankfully, that dogma is untrue. Otherwise, just imagine that lake, whatever GPS location in the universe it is at, to be brimming with Christians that invented that very dogma. Now, another important characteristic of the church that helped elevate the Jewish cult to the level of a religion is pious forgery. The Catholic Encyclopedia, which happens to be the American spokesperson for Christianity, defines forgery as follows. Forgery differs very slightly from fraud. It is the deliberate untruthfulness of an assertion, or the deceitful presentation of an object, or a false ascription of a document with an intention to deceive and to injure while pretending to be honest. With an intention to deceive? Perhaps if the church had removed the conditionality of "with an intention to deceive" and had seen all forgery as deception regardless of intent, perhaps, just perhaps, it would have never indulged in forgery. But then the question would be, would there have been Christianity? And the answer is, perhaps not. The church claimed that this was a case of the ends justify the means, in that if people are saved from eternal damnation, then it's perfectly fine to use deceit and trickery. The question that is largely ignored in all of this is, what is that end and who did it benefit? Well, of course, it benefited the church. As per the end, the only goal of the church was to steer the Greco-Roman world away from paganism into the new religion that they had just founded. Why couldn't they let the pagans be? But that is a whole different topic for another video. So moving on, by the 6th century, pious frauds of the church had been systematized and raised to the dignity of doctrines by taking advantage of the naivety and ignorance of the people. Through audacious lying, the church continued to deceive. Now let's look at a story from the Old Testament that would give you an idea of the long history of deception through frauds and forgeries in Judeo-Christianity. By the end of the 7th century BCE, around 638, an 8-year-old Jewish prince named Josiah ascended the throne of Judah. Judah was the Jewish nation whose capital was Jerusalem. In the 18th year of Josiah's rule, in 621 BCE, while some repair work was being done in the Jerusalem temple, a remarkable discovery was made by the then priest Hilkiah. Now Hilkiah went and shared about his finding with Shaphan the scribe, and together they took their great find to Josiah. To verify the veracity of the find, Huldah, the lady fortune teller or prophetess, was consulted. With her help, it was concluded that this was the book of the law of Yahweh. It was at once concluded that this book was given to the ancestors of the present-day Israelites by Moses over 800 years before, and it was never heard of since. Now Huldah at once declared that Yahweh was very angry about it, because the Israelite ancestors and the earlier kings that came before Josiah did not heed the words of this book. So what did the book actually say? It revealed that the traditional practices of the cult of Yahweh, the local god of Jerusalem, had been wrong up until that point. The book also provided the authorization for an extensive religious and political reformation of the Jewish temple state of Judah. In adherence to the newly discovered law, Josiah ordered a thorough purification of the cult and abolition of all forms of polytheism from the Jewish religion and his kingdom. Now, this was something that was undertaken for the very first time in the history of Israel. Surprisingly, the stipulations also contained sanctions for territorial conquest and for the cleansing of the territory's inhabitants, which is basically ethnic cleansing. The now purified temple was declared to be the only legitimate religious institution, and Yahweh of Jerusalem the only deity whose worship would be permitted. All other gods and goddesses that were being worshipped until then were scrapped. Josiah's actions marked the birth of Judaism, the monotheistic version of the ancient Israelite religion. Now, several questions can be raised here, beginning with: why did the supposedly all-knowing Yahweh keep quiet for 800 years without even informing his prophets through visions and prophecies, as was the norm in the Israelite society back then, about a book that contained the only way that the Jewish religion should have been practiced? Answering this question and several such questions would lead to the conclusion that this entire episode was staged, meaning a fraud. And for Josiah to lament that Yahweh punished the Israelite ancestors because they disobeyed the laws of the book that they never knew existed adds to the spuriousness of the whole episode. It was pointed out by Wilhelm Martin de Wet, one of the founding fathers of biblical criticism and theologians back in 1805, that firstly, the entire so-called book of law was written and planted by Hilkiah the chief priest, and secondly, the myth of its sudden mysterious discovery, yes, that's what he called it, the myth of its sudden mysterious discovery in the temple was made up by his son, the biblical prophet Jeremiah. By de Wet's assertion, the first is a forgery and the second is a fraud. This book was what makes up the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, either in part or whole. What this means is that the tradition that Moses wrote the Deuteronomy, or that Deuteronomy is of antiquity, is false. Beginning here, fraud had become an important part of Judeo-Christianity. In the early years of Christianity's invention, the church not only created false biblical narratives and forged the books in the Bible, but also immediately during the years following Christianity's officiation by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the church also meddled with secular historical literature of the time. It falsely interpolated passages into historical records of the time in order to validate the already circulating myths about Jesus and the apostles and their activities. These damning doings of the church are thankfully preserved in many clerical volumes and concealed in many archives. Of them, we will look at 3 most important sources. Our first source is the Church Fathers. Our Church Fathers are divided into 2 categories. The first is the Ante-Nicene Fathers. The second is Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers. Nicene is a reference to the council held in 325 CE under the leadership of Constantine, wherein the cult of Christianity attained the status of Rome's official religion. Ante-Nicene Fathers is a name given to the collection of the 10 surviving writings of the founders of Christianity from the very beginning of the Christian cult down to the Council of Nicaea. Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers is the name given to a work consisting of 28 volumes of early Christian writings that came after the Council of Nicaea. They have been produced in 2 series of 14 volumes each. Together with Ante-Nicene Fathers, they outline the founding and the progress of Christianity and report in great detail the crucial theological controversies, disputes and disagreements in doctrinal matters during the 4th through the 6th centuries when the conceptualization of the Christian religion was taking place. Our second source is Catholic Encyclopedia. The Catholic Encyclopedia is the most famed body of academic opinion on Christianity ever assembled in all of human history. It is a 15-volume comprehensive resource on teaching, history, and information related to Christianity, and it was printed between 1907 and 1912. Our third source that we are going to look at in this video is the Encyclopedia Biblica. The Encyclopedia Biblica is a 4-volume critical dictionary of the literary, political, and religious history, archaeology, geography, and natural history of the Bible. It was first printed in 1899. Now let's look at some of the admissions of the founding fathers. Our first confessor is Paul of the New Testament. He was originally called Saul of Tarsus, the leader of the very first Jewish converts to Christianity, making him the founder of Christianity and its fervent propagandist in the last half of the 1st century. Hence, he finds place in this list even though tradition does not categorize him under church fathers in that sense. There are 14 books in the New Testament ascribed to Paul under the category of epistles. They are claimed to have been written around the mid-1st century, even before the biographies of Jesus were written down. At least half of those that are ascribed to Paul have now been proven to be forgeries of later centuries. In the context of fraud, Paul went on record admitting to have been crafty to capture unsuspecting believers through deception. This admission is preserved in a book in the Bible called 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the second part of verse 16, which says, "Being crafty, I caught you with guile." In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 and 22, Paul openly glories in the affirmation of practicing imposture and dishonesty. He says, "For unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men." If Paul had not used the words, "that I might gain the Jews," probably Paul could have been absolved of trickery and disguise with intention to deceive. Paul's most important admission appears in Romans chapter 3, verse 7. He says, "For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? In simple terms, Paul is saying, if my fraud is bringing glory to God, then how come it is termed falsehood and treated as a sin? And why am I judged as a sinner? There are other trickeries that Paul introduced to Christianity when it was still in the cult stage. These trickeries were accepted as doctrines when the cult was given the status of a religion, because the trickery suited the church's agenda of usurping power and acquiring wealth. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 6 and 7, Paul explains how much should be given and with what attitude. Paul makes it appear as if giving donations was purely for the benefit of the believer and that the church gained nothing from it. He said that blessings of God are directly proportional to the amount the believer gave. Basically, he's saying, you get what you pay for. By this definition, the richer a person is, the bigger the blessing he received from God. And how did Paul know all of this? Well, the Christian God is supposed to have appeared to Paul in a vision and told him all the theology that Paul was to adapt for the new religion that he was going to found. Now, let me explain what was happening here. These financial elements of deviousness, enrichment, and trickery are mere elements of monetary greed, which enriched the church in the later centuries. The general consensus is that these verses were inserted into the Christian literature by some anonymous persons writing in the name of Paul, which the church accepted covetously as the epistles of Paul. These were then rewritten and amended continuously according to the changing trends in societies throughout the 1st to 4th centuries. Many historians now consider the epistles of Paul as fake, making those writings the biggest fraud in all of human history. Our next confessor is the most important figure in the history of Christianity. He is called Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius lived between 265 and 340 CE. He was the court historian of Constantine and was his official propagandist. He was called the father of church history because of his elaborate work called Ecclesiastical History, or simply Church History. It was written around 326 CE, a year after the Nicene Council. Ecclesiastical history contains the most important writings of Christianity as it chronicles the events of the first 3 centuries of the Common Era from the context of the fabrication and the development of Christianity. No other ancient source comes close to this work with respect to facts about early Christianity. Eusebius makes a crucial confessor of fraud in Christianity because he was one of a few who actually had decisive control over the formation of the Christian faith. And everything in his job description was dedicated to making Christianity appear legitimate. And in that sense, Eusebius happens to be the very first Christian apologist. But Eusebius abused the power of his pen by inventing lies about the biblical texts, characters, and events. Eminent historians, both critics and defenders, have called Eusebius names like the gravest of church historians, as suggested by Edward Gibbon, a 17th century English historian. He was also called a very dishonest man, or one of the most prolific forgers and liars of his age of the church. Eusebius was also called a notorious author of a great many falsehoods. Ecclesiastical means relating to the church or its clergy. In his Ecclesiastical History, Book 8, Chapter 2, Eusebius writes, "But it is not our place to describe the sad misfortunes which finally came upon the Christians, as we do not think it proper to record their divisions and unnatural conduct to each other before the persecution. Wherefore, we have decided to relate nothing concerning them, except things in which we can vindicate the divine judgment. But we shall introduce into this history in general only those events which may be useful first to ourselves and afterwards to posterity." Eusebius was telling the scribes whom he employed to create church history, that they were not supposed to report any misfortune or disagreements that they were having among themselves or the natural conduct that they showed to each other. They were to report as history only those events that could benefit them first. All other events were to be concealed. Our next confessor is Jerome, who lived from 347 to 420 CE. Jerome was a Latin church father who was commissioned by Pope Damasus in 382 CE to revise and refine the corrupt Latin versions of the Bible produced from 150 CE up until his time. Jerome's task was to translate all the archaic Latin Bibles into an everyday Latin version. This version came to be called the Vulgate, which means common in Latin. The Vulgate became the official Bible of the Church for more than a millennium. Jerome included in his Vulgate all the books of the New Testament, but denied the authenticity of a few books that surprisingly the New Testament still contains today. And these books were Philemon, Hebrews, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and also Revelation. According to Jerome, these books were of doubtful authorship, meaning forgeries. In the preface of the 4 Gospels of his Vulgate version addressed to Pope Damasus, Jerome admitted, "We must confess that as we have it in our language, it is marked by discrepancies." Jerome also lamented it was useless to correct the new for versions of scripture which already exist in the languages of many nations show that their additions are false. What this means is that the Bible had already gone out into the world with false additions and discrepancies, and it would be useless for Jerome to correct them in the version that he was producing. In the case of the Vulgate version of the Old Testament, Jerome had 2 sources to render from: the Hebrew version and the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Jerome was expected to use the Septuagint because of the affinity of Romans to Greek as opposed to Hebrew. But to the chagrin of his colleagues, he decided to make the Hebrew version his primary source and depended on the Septuagint only sparingly. The reason for this is Jerome considered the Septuagint only a translation and not a revelation of God, whereas the Hebrew versions, he took them to be revelations. According to him, the Septuagint had many corruptions. And according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, which says voluntarily or involuntarily, the copyists allowed many textual corruptions, transpositions, additions, and omissions to creep into the primitive text of the Septuagint. It further admits it is a material impossibility to transcribe absolutely without error the whole long work, and one may be sure that no 2 copies of the same original will be alike in every detail. Now we know how so many versions of Christianity emerged over the centuries. But that is not the worst part. The most colossal blunder that the Greek-speaking Septuagint translators made is a mistranslation of the Hebrew text found in a book called Isaiah in chapter 7 verse 14. This is a verse in the Old Testament that is shown by Christians as an evidence of a prophecy for the futuristic event of the virgin birth of the Christian God-man Jesus. But the evidence fails the linguistic test and turns out to be a slip of the translators. The word used in this verse by the original Hebrew writers was Alma. Alma means a young woman of marriageable age, whether married or not, whether a virgin or has had sexual experience. Alma does not in any sense mean a woman who has not had sexual experience, which leaves room for being sexually active. If the Hebrew writers wanted to mean a woman who was a virgin, the word they would have used is Betula, which leaves no room for speculation or uncertainty as to the woman's virginity status. Now, Betula has been consistently used in passages where the writers were talking about mere ordinary women who were most definitely virgins, whether young or old, without any room for uncertainty. And this verse in Isaiah was about the mother of a God-man. Mother of Jesus cannot be an ordinary woman, and Alma can most definitely not be used for her. Because when Alma is used, she is a young unmarried woman with the probability of not being a virgin, which would be a blunder to use it for the mother of the Christian God-man. The Hebrew original says, Hinne ha-alma hara ve-yeldet ben ve-karat shemmo Immanuel. Honestly translated, the verse reads, Behold, the young woman has conceived and bears a son and calls his name Immanuel. The Greek translators of the Septuagint slipped up and translated Alma into the Greek Parthenos, which means virgin, which leaves no room for speculation or uncertainty with regards to virginity. But the slip did not matter at the time. For in context, Isaiah's prophecy had been given as a reassurance to King Ahaz of Judah that his royal line would survive despite the ongoing siege of Jerusalem by the Syrians. The prophecy had nothing to do with any virgin or her conception or the Messiah of the world or events in Bethlehem 800 years into the future. This slip was taken advantage of by the deceitful early Christians, allowing them to concoct their infamous prophecy that somehow the ancient Jewish text foretold of the arrival of an infant actually called Jesus and sanctioned his miraculous virgin birth. It is from this corrupted text that Jerome made the biggest mistake in the history of Christianity. He translated the Hebrew word for a young woman as untouched instead of a young girl who may or may not be a virgin. Either Jerome intentionally erred or it was an oversight. If it was a genuine error, then it must be the greatest error of all times. But if it was intentional, it makes the greatest fraud of all times. There is more probability that this was intentional, considering Jerome's expertise in Hebrew and the fact that he did not rely on the Septuagint alone and rendered his translation from the Hebrew text. Now, Jerome himself wrote that he was criticized by many of his contemporaries for his virgin birth falsification. He even reluctantly replied to one of his critics, Javinianum, I know that the Jews are accustomed to meet us with the objection that in Hebrew, the word Alma does not mean a virgin, but a young woman, and to speak truth, a virgin is properly called Betula. Jerome intentionally clung to the error, thus perpetuating through 1500 years the myth of the prophetic virgin birth of the Judeo-Christian God-man. Other confessions of Jerome include his exhortations on translators for their fraudulent and lax ways. In his letter to Pammachius, the 4th century Roman senator, which is preserved as letter number 57, Jerome admits that it would be tedious to enumerate the additions and omissions that the translators of the Septuagint have made. He admits that the original Greek version of the New Testament contained mistakes introduced by inaccurate translators and the blundering alterations of confident but ignorant critics. And further, all that has been inserted or changed was done by copyists more asleep than awake. Now, why is the Septuagint important to our discussion? The Septuagint played a huge role in the formation of Christianity. Most of the early Christian movement was a Greek-speaking movement, and the New Testament was written in Greek. The early development of Christian theological concepts and liturgical language is almost exclusively indebted to the Septuagint, and it would not be an exaggeration to say that the Septuagint lied at the foundation of early Christianity. Our next confessor is Aurelius Augustine of Hippo. He was another church father who was born in Roman Africa in present-day Algeria. He lived from 354 to 430 CE. Augustine was formally recognized in later centuries as one of the doctors of the church. Now, the doctor of the church is the one whose doctrinal writings have special authority in the Christian world. Augustine helped formulate the doctrine of original sin. That's how important he is to church history. He was the one to introduce the practice of critical biblical interpretation and helped lay the foundation of modern Christian dogma. The fact that lies, forgeries, fraud, pretenses, and deception became a tradition of Christian writings, and that all of it was justified in the name of the glory of God, is revealed in Augustine's undertaking of 2 treatises on lying and deception. The first was a condemnatory treatise to the priesthood, entitled De Mendatio, which means on lying. It was written in 395 CE. Despite this undertaking of Augustine, fraud in Christian writings continued. It became so grave that 25 years later, in 420 CE, Augustine found it necessary to supplement his previous effort with another book called Contra Mendacium, which means against lying. This book was considered by some to be a protest against these pious frauds in the early Christian writings. Of particular interest to the topic are his letters to Jerome. In one of his letters, Augustine points out Jerome's intentional falsehood in translating a passage in Galatians chapter 2 verses 11 to 14. This passage describes a dispute between Paul and Peter at Antioch. Augustine's Contra Mendacium is addressed to Conscientius, a Spanish bishop who specifically asked Augustine whether lying were permissible in order to convert a Christian-inspired pagan sect called Priscillianists. In this letter, Augustine presents a close examination of alleged cases of lying in the Old Testament. With wavering and uncertain language on these points, he furnishes abundant materials for controversy. Augustine concludes that the instances of untruthfulness in the Bible are not to be considered lies, as they present a metaphorical meaning and are therefore rather considered as allegories. With this proposition, Augustine absolved the Bible of its lies, but raises another crucial problem, which is what from the Bible should be taken as allegory and what should be taken as factual. Among others, should the story of Jesus be taken as an allegory? Augustine's definition of lie, as preserved in the Catholic Encyclopedia, which says, "A lie is a lie only when uttered with an intention to deceive." In other words, what he's saying is, all other lies are acceptable. Only those lies which are lied with an intention to deceive should be considered lies. If that is the definition of a lie, then it is important to define deception also. Is lying for spreading Christianity a deception or is it not? And also, who decides what is deception? The deceived or the deceiving? By Augustine's definition of a lie, no pastor who performs miracle charades is a deceiver or a liar. But is that really the case? While Augustine wrote elaborate tracts on the problem of deception in the church, it's not as if he applied that yardstick of ethics to himself. Knowing that the church used this character as a device for winning the credulous over to their side, Augustine glorified it. This trait has run riot through the centuries and flourishes even today among the priests and the ignorant pious. Now let's look at the 2 official spokesmen of the Christian Church. The first is the Catholic Encyclopedia. This voluminous work has several admissions about the forgeries and manipulations that the Church Fathers committed. It confesses of them that they were writing with little to no scientific knowledge. There are large sections in Catholic Encyclopedia with assertions to how the writers of the Bible fixed dates and chronologies long after those events were written down. About the dating of creation account in the book of Genesis, the Catholic Encyclopedia admits that at least 200 dates have been suggested, varying from 3483 to 6934 BCE, indicating firstly that the formulators did not agree among themselves, and secondly, how unscientific and illogical they were to have come up with such a young model of the universe. The Catholic Encyclopedia also admits that the Bible has no chronology at all, and that in the matter of numbers, it is corrupted by the time it reached us, and as a result, there is no way of knowing what is true. It concludes that the books of the Bible are not merely history, meaning it wasn't written from a historical point of view, but was written from a religious point of view. Therefore, all attempts to treat it as history must be abandoned. Since there's no chronology to the Bible, how did the early Christians come up with dates, especially the division of eras into Anno Domini and before Christ? Well, the Catholic Encyclopedia has an answer to this. It says that this was a goof up, which makes it the second biggest intentional error after the virgin birth falsification. The Catholic Encyclopedia says it was a monk of the 6th century named Dionysius Exiguus who fixed our present Christian era, laying down that Jesus was born on the 25th of December 753 AUC. AUC is the Roman dating system which begins with Rome's founding. It stands for Ab Urbe Condita. Catholic Encyclopedia confirms that date, as we shall see, cannot be correct, and instead of being an improvement on, is farther from the truth. It further mentions that the early church fathers, Saint Irenaeus and Tertullian, fixed the date of the birth of Jesus. The question here is, why should the date for history's only extraordinary miraculous event be fixed by someone 2 or 3 centuries after the alleged event had taken place? Isn't that itself suspicious as to the occurrence of the event? Catholic Encyclopedia further admits that there is no chronology to the events of the alleged birth of Jesus. The question is, how did the church come up with what happened after that? For example, the Bible recounts that several innocent babies were killed by King Herod. But going by the assertion of Catholic Encyclopedia, which says, since the chronology of the birth of Christ and the subsequent biblical events is most uncertain, it is impossible to determine the date or the year of the death of the Holy Innocents. The Holy Innocents is the name given to the children who are reported to have been killed under King Herod. Not only were the dates and chronology fixed, even the dates for the most historically miraculous events of crucifixion and resurrection were fixed long after those events had been written down in the New Testament. The Catholic Encyclopedia reports the Savior must have died between AD 26 and 36. First of all, 10 years is a bit too long a range to date an event that allegedly occurred in the 1st century, which is not too long ago. Secondly, the speculative usage of must have died raises the suspicion as to whether or not the events actually happened. Catholic Encyclopedia further reports that based on the fixing of the date for crucifixion, 3 other dates were fixed. The date for the resurrection 3 days later, the date for the ascension into heaven 40 days later, and the coming of the Holy Spirit onto the apostles 10 days later, fixing all through. On the origin of the early Christian writings, Catholic Encyclopedia admits in its preface, the titles of the Gospels as we have them today are not original and do not go back to the 1st century of the Christian era. What this means is that the evangelical narratives were anonymous writings and were not written by the people they are ascribed to. The ascription as we have them today of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John have been made in the later centuries. In other words, they are forgeries, according to the definition of forgery set forth by Catholic Encyclopedia itself. Of the New Testament, the Catholic Encyclopedia says the idea of a complete and clear-cut official version of the New Testament from the time of Jesus' apostles is not a historical fact. The New Testament, like the Old Testament, was the result of a development of a process that was stimulated by disputes with doubters both within and without the church. The final version was not reached until the Council of Trent in 1546. It further admits our documentary sources of knowledge about the origins of Christianity and its earliest development are chiefly the New Testament scriptures and various sub-apostolic writings, the authenticity of which we must, to a great extent, take for granted here. In essence, what Catholic Encyclopedia is saying is that the forged New Testament booklets and the writings of the early Christians, who came to be called the Apostolic Fathers, are the sole evidence we have for the origins of Christianity. Our next source is the other spokesman of Christianity, the Encyclopedia Biblica. One sample reading from it goes as follows. The remark has long ago and often been made that, like Paul, even the earliest Gospels knew nothing of the miraculous birth of our Savior. What Encyclopedia Biblica is saying here is, when the Gospels were written, the Gospel writers did not know anything about a God-man being born miraculously, meaning a virgin giving birth to a God-man, just like Paul did not. To sum this all up, I would like to quote the world-leading German biblical scholar Konstantin von Tischendorf of the 19th century. He is credited with the discovery of the oldest manuscript of the Bible compiled in the 4th century called Codex Sinaiticus. Tischendorf said this about the New Testament: "The New Testament has been altered in many places and is not to be accepted as true. Based on the confessions found in these volumes, it would be no exaggeration to say that the Bible, in the strictest legal and moral sense, is a huge forgery, that the church was founded upon petty forgeries and pious frauds, that every book in the New Testament is a forgery of the Christian church. The Gospels are all priestly forgeries carried out almost a century after their pretended dates, that the two most crucial sentences found in the Bible that became the cornerstone of the Christian church and the basis for invading nations in the name of evangelizing were never uttered by any Jew, much less the alleged Jesus, but are palpable and easily proven late church forgeries of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Those sentences are, 'Upon this rock I will build my church,' which is mentioned in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. And the other sentence is, 'Go teach all nations,' as mentioned in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. In conclusion, a colossal fraud is at the very foundation of Christianity, making it a religion purely built on lies, forgery, and deception. There was never any period of time in all of history in which so many forgeries and so much fraud was publicly committed. Throughout the history of Christianity, pious fraud has been justified with the belief that ends will justify the means. The end is to convert as many people by whatever means available, by lying, forging, or deceiving. And you and I scratch our heads wondering why some pastors' conscience does not prick, and why they do not even bat an eyelid when they cheat gullible people, knowing fully well that what they are doing is fraud. Every awakened believer must feel outraged in his dignity and self-respect, and in disgust must reject the dogma and the deceivers. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in another episode. Until then, namaste.